Okay. Hey, everyone. Um, let's see if we can invite some people into the stream. Thanks for your patience while I've worked out these technical issues. Good old technology. All right, just going to quickly paste an invitation to everybody in Canvas announcements. Okay. Let's see. New consultation. Can't see the screen. Stream link. Team. Some technical issues. Christopher Groot, learn how to spell. Cannot spell my own name. Come on, Chris. All flustered. All right, new consultation stream link. There we go. Send it out to everybody. Am I in the right Canvas subject? Yes, I am. All right, things are looking up. People are in the chat. Hello, everyone. Having my own little breakdown here. We're live, albeit using my iPhone as a camera because my streaming camera, which is just as my glorious exercise bike, which is very much ornamental. Unfortunately, I need to do something about that. This thing has decided not to speak to the computer today. Naughty streaming camera. So that's all right. We'll make do. So I think we've got audio, which is good. I can see the little green lights blipping. And everyone's coming in. Hi, Yuan. Ding, welcome back. Tim, good to see you still with us. A hammer on the desk. Yeah, I think that would be good. Thanks for your email overnight, Paul. I haven't got a chance to get to it yet, but I will today. Did I turn it off and on again? I actually had to turn it off and on again twice. I have tried, I think this is the 5th stream that I've tried since I last saw you. So let's get into it. I'm going to jump into Piazza and open up our week 3 digital mailbox. And I'm also going to remind us that I think it was Ding asked a question in the previous stream about stigma and why we're reading so much about stigma and doing so much work around that. So why would one consider doing a lab report about stigma? So when we design any sort of assessment, any sort of lab report, we don't just choose a topic randomly. We really try to think about how you can do. Oh, right. I see what you're saying, Ding. Yeah. So how we can get most value out of a project for you, how you can get a really valuable learning experience in terms of the acquisition of knowledge or skills that's beyond the actual the core requirements of learning how to write a lab report, for example. So if you think back to Mind, Brain, and Behavior 1, if you were in that subject, the essay that we developed was around exploring different study skill strategies and how they hold up under stress. And so in the doing, you are actually picking up a lot of information in your very first semester at university about how to study effectively, how stress can affect your ability to retain information, and maybe what are some good strategies then to use around learning and study in the context of stress and what the limitations are. So you were actually starting to pick up some psychological tools and tips and tricks. And certainly this semester, the experience is no different. So what I'm asking you to do here is essentially consider your own learning process to reflect. So not just write a lab report about any topic about mental health, and it could have, but one that we could, a topic that's very relevant to mental health that we could actually manipulate in a lab report. And so think about the symptoms that, the signs and symptoms that we've covered in the last few weeks around mental health. Obviously, it wouldn't be ethically sound to conduct a clinical trial around actual mental health symptoms, for example, in an educational setting. But, one of the outcomes we want for our graduates from the university is to have, a really socially responsible mindset and awareness of issues and sensitive issues, and know some of the fundamental concerns around those issues, and be informed and go out into the world as socially responsible citizens. And knowing that so many people are interested in becoming a psychologist or in working in some other area of the mental health workforce, this is one of the reasons why I've chosen stigma for our particular assignment. It is something that we can manipulate, that is meaningful to manipulate, and we're doing it through something that is an approach that is theorized to reduce stigma about the experience of mental illness, and that's education and contact. And we've been building so much into the curriculum. I have been building so much into the curriculum around stigma and mental health in the last couple of years, because it's something I'm really passionate and interested in. And it's very good for you to learn about, because stigma affects people with lived experience in so many different ways. It's certainly a profound barrier to help seeking. We know that people are less likely to seek help if they're aware that the thing that they're seeking help for is culturally stigmatized. We know that stigma can compound, can exacerbate existing symptoms of depression, for example, and other symptoms as well. And certainly symptoms of psychosis too. So now my screen is glitching out. Unbelievable. I'm going to put you over on this other screen. This computer's conspiring against me today. But I think your question is maybe a little bit different now that I read it again. Is the question, I think, more about why we would be replicating something, replicating a type of trial, given that there have been similar types of trials of contact and education-based interventions before. Ultimately, you got to remember this is a teaching tool, right? So we're not going to publish this. If I wanted to publish this, I'd be doing it in a different way. It would be much tighter, much more rigorous. But in terms of the literature around hybrid interventions, and particularly at this scale, there's pretty much not a lot out there at this scale, and certainly in the Australian context. and dealing with samples that are very multicultural in nature. There are there's not a lot of literature out there, so we're not really getting into something that's been done to death in the literature. In fact, this is quite I would suggest, an area of literature in which there's a lot of work still yet to be done. In future iterations of the lab report, and this lab report is evolving over time, this is the second year in which we've run it, I will change it in various ways, and maybe we will get ethics, and maybe we will write it up and run it as a real experiment. But ultimately, it's a teaching tool, so a little bit of replication never hurts. In fact, generally, we want to see replication of findings in psychology. So many good studies are replications in part and then extensions. So they replicate a previous study and then extend the findings. And what we really want to see in psychology is that replication of findings. If a certain study found a certain outcome, we want to be able to replicate it using the same methods to confirm the outcome and confirm that there is actually an effect there. I hope that makes sense. So very long answer to your question there, Ding, but I hope that touches what you are asking about. And Nicholas, yeah, that's a really good question. I had a coffee discussion with a bunch of psychologists the other day, and we were talking about stigma and our own stigma, and acknowledging that we are inherently biologically hardwired to stigmatize things, and particularly on things that we might think are unpredictable based on behavior. And acknowledging that we have that own stigma in ourselves, and certainly, I think education and starting to think about these issues is really a really important route to reducing our own personal stigma, and I think that's a really meaningful area of self-improvement too. Okay, let's get into some questions. So, Kelly, hi, Kelly. This week's lecture, I mentioned that you see personality disorders very little in clinical practice. Is this because people are reluctant to seek help? No, it's quite often because people don't feel that they need to seek help. So it will vary very considerably across different types of personality disorders. So some personality disorders maybe don't elicit as much distress as others. And quite often people might find environments where they can thrive in the context of their personality disorders. Nobody mentioned Trump at this point. But what we would see is maybe personality disorders that are experienced with high levels of distress and dysfunction impacting life, presenting more often in a clinical setting. And that would be experiences like borderline personality disorder. If you looked in the corrections system, for example, the prison system and the justice system and so forth, you would tend to see other types of personality issues more often, like antisocial personality traits. That we didn't cover antisocial personality disorder in the lecture, but it's associated with a pattern of manipulation and lying and cheating, a complete lack of remorse for taking advantage of others, being violent, having issues with authority, having issues with power, and so forth. And you can imagine how people with those sorts of ways of being, those sorts of traits, might end up in trouble with the law. And indeed, if we think about personality issues and disorders as a group in the correction system, you would be seeing more antisocial personality disorder than anything else. And then there are, generally people will carve out ways of being, if possible, around those other maybe sub-threshold personality issues like obsessive compulsive personality disorder. Sort of sub-threshold traits can actually be seen in a lot of academics. I can certainly see it in myself from time to time. I find my sort of traits become expressed a little bit more in response to certain environmental conditions and tend to ebb and flow. In fact, right now, when I'm just coming out of a busy period, but during that busy period, I would be, probably what people would say would be, excessively conscientious, and sort of ticking a lot of those obsessive compulsive personality traits, and hopefully at what I'd consider would be a subclinical threshold, but at a subclinical level. But so many of the traits that we talk about in these personality issues and across these mental health conditions, of course, more broadly, these experiences, again, you'll probably find that as we've gone through, you might think, that sort of sounds like me at times, or I can see myself in that, and I can see myself in that, and I can see myself in that. And indeed, I can see little bits of, the variety of experiences we've talked about in my own experience over time. And that's because, and in subtle forms, and that's because so many of the things that we talk about with mental health issues are, again, very extreme forms of more everyday life experiences. So I hope that answers that question, Callie. The thing with personality based disorder as well, another thing is that people can view those, I suppose, disordered states as just attributable to personality, and therefore, might look at a person who is having some profound difficulty maybe as being more annoying, but looking at it through a normal lens, for want of a better term, instead of recognizing that the person might be having a problem. Maybe they're irritating and annoying, but that might actually be a symptom or a sign of disturbance for the person, for which they could really benefit from some support and assessment and treatment and so forth. So you're right. Looking at psychological issues through the lens of what's relatable to people can elicit certain types of responses that generally sort of surround negative emotion like irritation, frustration, anger, and so forth. And indeed, we see this play out when we look at stigma around negative symptoms of psychosis. So whereas positive symptoms of schizophrenia, for example, like hallucinations and delusions that Sandy was talking about yesterday, would tend to elicit public responses of unpredictability and dangerousness and fear responses and social distancing. What you would see around the negative symptoms of psychosis, such as avolition, having low motivation to get up and get going and achieve goals, you tend to see that bring out different types of stigma. So not fear and perceptions of dangerousness, but instead people looking at that more relatable behavior that's easier to understand through the experience of psychological wellness, relatively speaking, looking at it through the lens of laziness. And so that tends to elicit, if you have that attribution of that person's lazy because of that behavior, instead of recognizing that as a clinical symptom or a sign of a problem, one looks at it through that lens and becomes irritated, frustrated, and so forth in response. No, Paul, the client doesn't necessarily need to experience distress, but it is there most often. There's certainly exceptions to the rule, certainly around substance use and abuse, certainly around mania and hypomania. So we think about distress and dysfunction. Again, that Jerome Wakefield's harmful dysfunction analysis of mental disorder, thinking about those two things as being really important. Glad that helped, Callie. All right. Let me... you're welcome, Paul. Hey, Emily, that's a really good point. So if somebody isn't being impacted, if there's no impact on functioning, there's no distress, it sounds to me like there's probably not disorder there. If there's no negative impact, if somebody... so, one would have to consider, what the issues were. They're probably quite mild and probably not at a level of clinical significance at which would, tick criteria off for a disorder, to put it in very simple terms. Hey, Vincent, yes, that's a really good question. So Vincent asks, have we deliberately not covered types of treatment? Yeah, we have deliberately not covered types of treatment. So previously I have, but in reevaluating what this first year course should be, I decided not to take us down the treatment route because there's just not sufficient time for me to bring you on a journey to understand, firstly, the issues themselves. And let's face it, we've done with clinical psychology now, essentially, right? And we've just scratched the surface. I think you've probably got a sense of this. We've just scratched the surface. We haven't had an opportunity to get into treatment. Having said that, I have been considering that an interesting idea would be to hold a special masterclass at some point during the semester, and certainly which could just be an optional thing for people that are interested to come. I could do a live stream masterclass, and it could be on something like cognitive behavior therapy, for example, for people who are interested in treatment. So if that sounds interesting, let me know. It would be a non-assessed thing and just a more social and interesting thing to support your interest if you are interested. Yeah, Brooke, quite often people with certain personality traits will find themselves in, or just move into areas in which these types of traits are allow one to flourish. And I wasn't kidding when I said I've got those sorts of traits. And in fact, I was talking about this group of psychologists who I was having coffee with just in the last few days, and we were all talking about our own OCPD traits and how that plays out over time for us and ebbs and flows. So when I say it's not unusual to see this in academia, it's not unusual to see this in academia. When it gets to a level where it starts to impact on work function, though, then that's more rare. So we're probably, again, considering traits that are sub-threshold and not impacting on functioning. What is the actual meaning of a stigmatizing condition? Asks Ding. If I just don't want to have some trouble with the people with mental illness, like they can't control their emotions, is that stigmatizing? Yeah, so I suppose that's a good question. So there's an example of what might be considered a stereotype, Ding. So people with mental illness can't control their emotions. So that is an attribution, an interpretation, a stereotype that we might then apply to everyone with mental illness. But let me ask you this, based on the lecture series that we've had so far, and based on the Hearing Voices program and hearing from Sandy and so forth, is that what you've observed when I've talked about all of the different disorders that we have? Have I talked about, really profound emotion dysregulation across the disorders? Did I mention that around schizophrenia, for example? And the answer would be no, right? So the education is sort of hopefully chipping away at those sorts of preconceived ideas and actually demystifying what these things actually are. And emotion dysregulation is not necessarily a part of all mental disorders. So when we talk about stigma about mental illness, what we do find is that people might have these broad stereotypes about what mental illness is that are false. And if you can provide factual information to replace that counterfactual or false information that's been those counterfactual beliefs that have been very much based on media and television and movies and so forth, then we see that a more informed perspective can reduce stigma. And certainly when you interact with somebody like Sandy yesterday, and you can observe that Sandy actually had her emotions in check yesterday, then and you get to interact with her as a person, that tends to elicit empathy. So, of course, we're just talking about mental illness here, and you can. There are so many things that are stigmatized, isn't there? There have, obviously there's stigma related to one's racial or cultural background, sex or gender, religious or spiritual affiliation, physical makeup, height, hair color, weight, all sorts of things have been stigmatized and are stigmatized. And so what we do generally see across the span of these sorts of instances of stigma is that there are certain things that hold true. And one is that providing education and correct information to replace those false understandings can decrease stigma, and contact-based interventions are really good at decreasing stigma and improving empathy as well. Yeah, that's right, Kelly. Good point. And Mungji here asks, is it possible for people diagnosed with schizophrenia to have positive and negative symptoms at the same time? Yes, that is very much very, very possible. Yeah. Vincent asks, what is your favorite DJ set tracks you play when you're feeling down? Ooh, down. That's a really good question, Vincent. I have to admit, I don't often feel down, but if I want to motivate myself with work, I find that, and this is evidence-based, that anything recursive and without vocals typically tends to work for me. I think on my Facebook page, I posted a set that I was listening to this morning. I probably posted it really early in the morning. Did I do that on Facebook? I did it somewhere, some social media place today, I'm sure. So who do I listen to? At the moment, I am listening to a lot of a duo called Above and Beyond. Lots of Jodie Wisternoff, Nick Warren, James Warren, Honey Dijon. Can't get enough of Honey Dijon. If you don't know Honey Dijon and you like Chicago House, you don't even know what Chicago House is, and you want to explore, go and check out Honey Dijon. The Pachanga Boys. Anything that you'd find really at Burning Man, Rainbow, Serpent, Tullum, Day One, Damien Lazarus, all those sorts of guys. Oh my God, you saw Honey Dijon in New York City. I am so jelly. All right, let's get into Piazza. But there you go. You know who I would be listening to on any given day. Okay, so question here on Piazza from Samuel in the digital mailbox for this week. Does the schizotypy diathesis include all of those listed elements, or is just one of them indicate the presence of schizotypy? We think about schizotypy as incorporating all of those elements that I introduced you to in the lecture in terms of anhedonia, perceptual aberration, magical thinking, and actually then some that I didn't mention in the lecture just to keep things simple. Things like cognitive disorganization and so forth. There's slightly different definitions of what schizotypy actually is. But essentially, we're talking about more subtle experiences that correspond to those experiences that we'd see in schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorders, for example. So we think about, just like schizophrenia is made up of different signs and symptoms, for example, we think about schizotypy as being made up by different dimensions that correspond to those different signs and symptoms. So we've got a question here from Samuel again about dissociative experiences. Are dissociative experiences a flawed perception of reality, or are they a bit deeper than that? This is a different type of experience, Samuel. So not necessarily poor reality contact, but a fracturing of psychological experiences that can certainly impact our conscious experience of reality if occurring, at a reasonably high level, where it's starting to impact memory and our conscious experience of the world. So those absorption phenomena, there's a question here about the amnesia. So the absorption phenomena being off in your head in a different place to where your conscious experience of the world around you would be, and that's considered to be an element of dissociative experience. And certainly at the point at which one is not aware of their actions and is in an inner world, or for example, if we're thinking about dissociative identity disorder, if an alter was present, then one is typically not aware of the passage of time and activity. So, dissociative identity disorder aside, there's experiences like what's called a dissociative fugue, where somebody would find themselves in a place that they have traveled to, and they've got no recollection of how they've got there. There is this amnesic symptom again, not remembering how one's got there, have not been aware of the passage of time and of what's gone on as one has traveled. Dissociation again, and these aspects of immersion in daydreaming, for example, an absorption of um, what was I going to say? Yeah, these are very much, again, potentially experienced in very subtle forms by us all from time to time. We do have an ability to selectively attend to certain things, but still be aware of other things, and have some degree of um, split consciousness, I suppose, but just at very subtle sort of levels compared to what we're talking about when we're talking about the type of fracturing of awareness that we're talking about, and the fracturing of psychological processes that we're talking about when we think about dissociative identity disorder, for example. And another question here from Samuel. I've been struck by the concentration of dissociative identity disorder in the USA. Have there been any good reasons proposed? Is the potential evidence for the cultural influence on dissociative identity disorder? So Samuel hits it on the head there. Yes, this is evidence that supports the cultural influence of dissociative identity disorder as being a sanctioned way of expressing psychological distress. And people may have seen this in movies and so on, and have and maybe it's endorsed within that culture more than in other cultures. It trickles its way into maybe more emphasis in training and people looking for it as well, as in therapists looking for these sorts of issues. But the cultural influence, I should say, is not at odds with the traumatic theory. It's the rest of that socio-cultural theory of dissociative identity disorder is more at odds. But we know that, broadly speaking, dissociative identity disorder, or any other, I suppose, mental disorder that we've talked about during our time together over the last 3 months, are culturally sanctioned in a Western culture, at least. And that will influence the way in which psychological distress can manifest. What I also have not had time to speak with you about is how culture affects the expression of psychological distress and mental disorder, and the fact that there are other cultural syndromes that we would see in other cultures. A couple come to mind. Kyle Cap in Cambodia, for example. I don't know if anyone's from Cambodia out there or are familiar with the idea of Kyle Cap. This is what we'd call a cultural syndrome. Very much anxiety and panic related if we looked at it through a Western lens, but it's got no one-to-one correspondence with anything in the DSM-5. Ataque de nervios in Latin culture, Spanish culture, we would see this particular way of experiencing and expressing distress that, again, has got no one-to-one correspondence with anything that we would see in the DSM-5 or the ICD system. So Kyle Cap, for example, is experienced by a lot of panic-related symptoms in the body, but also a lot of catastrophic cognitions and a belief that there is a wind in the body that's rising, and it's rising to the point at which it would eventually affect people's upper organs and their brain, and this would have catastrophic implications and potentially death. And speaking of treatment, the culturally sanctioned treatment for Kyle Cap is what's called coining, and this is where a coining practitioner would rub a coin, like a money coin, on the body and abrase the body until, you're talking about bruises and abrasions, as a way of excising this chyle, this wind-like substance from the body, which is thought to cause these symptoms. Attacca nervios is characterized by extreme, inconsolable emotion dysregulation, screaming, really inconsolable emotional outbursts and so forth. And again, not something that maps directly onto anything we've got in the DSM-5. So mental disorder and expression of mental health problems is very much a response to culture and varies according to culture and certain types of symptoms. Like yesterday, Sandy and I were talking about, cross-cultural variation in the way in which auditory verbal hallucinations can manifest. And this is certainly a thing. So let me keep cracking through Piazza for a moment. Oh, okay. There's a question about Zoom links, and somebody's helped that person out. That's good. And a question here from Simona, again about dissociative identity disorder. Okay, so people are really interested in dissociative identity disorder. I get it. It's a fascinating idea, isn't it? A fascinating area of mental health problems. When discussing dissociative identity disorder, you mentioned the host personality isn't necessarily the original personality. Says Simona. I'm curious to know if there's an underlying reason for the original personality maybe not being present for the majority of the time. Yeah, sure. So there would be a reason. Obviously, these factors are all in response to different contexts. Again, remember, context is key. So signs and symptoms are always playing out in the context of personal experiences, familial relationships, environmental circumstances, history, neurobiological makeup, physiological makeup, and so forth. Ways of thinking and feeling, behaving, personality. Yes, all of these symptoms would vary according to context. And certainly somebody asked here, could that be around a threat? Yeah, that could be around threat. Indeed, it's not unusual for an alter to perform a protective sort of role. Sometimes the alters can be quite unidimensional in terms of the roles that one might perceive they play. And indeed, a protector alter has it's not uncommon that you might see that protector type alter approaching a psychologist in the first instance. For help for the person. So not necessarily the host personality presenting in the first instance. It could be an alter personality presenting and dealing with that potentially anxiety arousing situation of reaching out for help for the first time. Okay, Sona studies error. Oh dear. Okay. If you have any issues with any particular study, what you should do is email the researcher. Always email the researcher, and they will be able to help you one way or another. Okay, a question here about Sandy's live stream yesterday. Sandy mentioned bed as a battlefield yesterday. And that she was having those intrusive thoughts and the hallucinations occurring at night. And so the question here is, essentially one of medications. So essentially asking around, would additional medication be useful to suppress those sorts of difficulties that Sandy was having at night. I suppose I won't comment on Sandy's case specifically because it's not my place to, and I don't know what is Sandy's situation with medication, and that would be a matter for her and her treating clinicians. What I suppose any psychiatrist or GP, remember, psychologists don't prescribe medication, psychiatrists do. But what any psychiatrist and GP would be doing would be, over time, trying to find the optimal type and dose of and program of medication that allowed a client to function as well as possible in as many life domains as possible that were important to them, and balance that with symptom reduction. And hopefully there would be additional therapy, maybe talking therapy and so forth, that could complement that medication as well, and other types of interventions, family and social interventions and whatnot, that might be able to complement that medication. And it can really be a tricky line over time with maybe the episodic nature of illness as it waxes and wanes, to monitor that medication and the dosage and adjust appropriately according to how the client is going. And some medications can have really sedating effects, and one doesn't, of course, want to one would hope not to have a situation where somebody is incredibly sedated at the you wouldn't want to suppress symptoms, I suppose, for them. And this is such a big question. I feel like I could spend an hour on this with all of the various caveats that I'd like to put forward. But generally speaking, you want to find a balance there between functioning and well-being and symptom management. Yeah. I'm just having a look at our chat window here. Good luck with your procedure, Tim. Paul asks, do alters ever take over full-time from the host? Yeah, so this is what I was, I suppose, talking about with this idea that the host personality is not necessarily the original personality. It could be that the host has been an alter that is an alter that's been present for an extended period of time, and tends to be present for the majority of the time. Now, did I answer that question about medication? And the other thing to consider is that often it is very difficult to find a medication regime that will address all of the symptoms that somebody may be experiencing. There may be a breadth of symptoms, and maybe part of the medication regime may address one symptom or a number, and others may address others. And maybe we'd be looking to behavioral and psychological and social coping skills to manage some of the others. And, from a psychological perspective, that's really where we'd be a psychologist would be emphasizing their work would be around those coping skills and helping clients to develop coping skills to navigate and manage the various problems that they're having. And so that mental arithmetic here, Evie has asked about, is that sort of how efficacious is that next to when held up next to medication in terms of managing hallucinations? It sounds to me like that really works for Sandy, and certainly there's a range of sort of evidence-based techniques that Sandy was actually talking about using in her management of hallucinations. So she talked about competing noise, and that's certainly true. She talked about playing music, and that's something that has that can interfere with the voices by basically creating competing activity in the auditory cortices. You are interfering with the voices at a neurobiological level. She also talked about mental arithmetic. So there's some interesting literature that's demonstrated that serial 3s or 7s, we'd say. So maybe, for example, counting backwards from 100 in multiples of 3 or 7 can be a useful way to interrupt aberrant auditory activity, like auditory verbal hallucinations, or even like earworms. Like what are earworms? Earworms. Getting a song stuck in your head. If you've got a song stuck in your head, like "Let It Go" from Frozen. Sorry, everyone, but that's one that usually gets me. Try counting backwards from 100 in 3s or 7s and see if that works. Paul, I will point you towards some resources to help you find out how to cite any particular source for your assignment. So stay tuned for that, and I'll post a link up on Let It Go. Let It Damn it. 97, 94. Evil. Okay, Zoom links, live stream lecture. The live stream lecture was St. Australia's lecture 6. Yes, that was lecture 6. That was the last lecture. So the big question, do you need to know what was said in that lecture? Yeah, you do. I'm going to ask exam questions about it. And that is really part of me valuing Sandy's input and me carrying through my promise to value lived experience in the curriculum. That for me this year is translating one of the ways in which I'm doing that meaningfully, and in practice is by deriving some exam questions from that last lecture. Having said that, the exam questions will be about really obvious things, very obvious main themes that Sandy and I talked about, things that you wouldn't miss if you've watched the lecture. Don't you baby shark me, Sandra. Oh my God. Evil. Oh, damn it. So, a question here from Ria about borderline personality disorder. So, one of the borderline personality disorder symptoms were frantic attempts to avoid real or imagined abandonment. And I was wondering, does that refer to one's desperate attempts or their anxiety to avoid being abandoned by people? Be it whether they really are being abandoned by people or if it's part of their perception only. Yes, that is spot on. So that's exactly what it's talking about there. Attempts to avoid abandonment by other people. That's correct. And this is why I am doing a lot of work in stigma around. I'm starting to fade already. It's because I've been working since 5 a.m. I need more coffee. This is why I'm doing work around stigma towards people with borderline personality disorders in the mental health system at the moment, because it's such an important issue, and it tends to play out quite commonly in a therapeutic setting around this fear of abandonment. So we know about social distance, right? And the psychological version of social distance. We know about this because it's the core measure for your assignment, remember? Yeah, okay. So, if I was somebody who lived with borderline personality disorder, and I did have a fear of abandonment, and I was always on the lookout for abandonment, if I go into seek help for distress, if I'm feeling distressed, if I go to seek help because of some of the signs and symptoms of BPD that I'm experiencing, and when seeking help from the clinician who's sitting across the room from me, I observe that they are stigmatized towards BPD, for example. So if that clinician has a stereotype that people with BPD are difficult to work with, what do you think that clinician will do? They're going to, at least to some degree, likely socially distance themselves within the context of the therapeutic relationship. That's going to be a problem. So there's this aspect of the treatment relationship that we call the therapeutic alliance. And this is the degree of rapport, of willingness to work together towards the person's treatment goals and so forth, how good that bond and relationship is in therapy. Now, if I've got stereotyped attitudes about people with BPD as a clinician, then when I work with somebody who does have BPD, that is to some degree going to subvert, it's going to chip away at, reduce the quality of the therapeutic alliance. I'm going to socially distance myself, and the person who lives with BPD, who's sitting across the room from me, will observe that. And of course, if one observes that the clinician is distancing themselves and effectively showing signs of abandonment, then that would increase, I suppose, distress and some of the signs and symptoms that one would present with in therapy, which would reinforce the clinician's stereotype, and it turns into a downward spiral. These things start to feed off each other in a negative way to disintegrate the therapeutic alliance. So a lot of the work that I'm doing at the moment, so for example, with one of my clinical master's students, we've just wound up a project with Sane Australia, Lifeline, On the Line, which is an organization that I used to work with in running lines like the Suicide Callback Service and Men's Line and the Suicide Line Victoria and so forth. And we're looking at how different signs and symptoms of borderline personality disorder can elicit different types of stigma from telephone counselors in a crisis call setting. And so we've just finished that. We're writing up the results right now. We'll be publishing the results in the next few months. And then based on those findings, what we're going to do is work basically with the telephone counselling sector in Australia to develop interventions that are going to address these the particular problem areas that we've identified to improve capacity of the telephone and online counselling, crisis counselling system in Australia to support people with BPD and improve outcomes. So it really is a big problem around clinical practice stigma about BPD. Okay. Yeah, that's right. If one's so there's a question here from Molly about pessimistic attributional style. That's right. So if there's a negative internalizing, sure, way of interpreting events in life. That's right. So it's about a cognitive bias where events in life would be interpreted through a lens that doesn't carry much hope. That's quite pessimistic, might lend itself to ideas around helplessness and things being too hard and too difficult, and so forth. And very much, I think, one to remember is that internal stable and global attributional style can be very much depressogenic, leading towards depression. Can we email tutors questions about lecture content? Not so much. I ask the questions about lecture content to the lecturers. The tutors are all very advanced in their studies, but may or may not necessarily have the answer to your question, and their question and answer and support for you that they get paid for it in terms of time each week is more to support you around assignments. And maybe that hasn't sort of necessarily come up for you just yet, but when we get towards the assignment submission time, you'll be probably drawing on your tutors a lot more. Question around question around the DSM-5 here. Oh, okay. Where can we find the DSM-5? On Canvas. The copy isn't actually on Canvas, but if you go to my Stephen's already answered this question. Okay, yes. If you go to the modules section under clinical psychology, you'll find the clinical psychology overview document. That's right. And the link to the DSM-5 is in there. Oh, okay. So this isn't a question as much as it is somebody sharing a range of links that they've found to interesting schizophrenia and DID related lived experience stories on YouTube. Yeah, that's great. So the first one there is about Eleanor Longden, and I used to show that one in lectures. I know Eleanor. So Eleanor Longden is somebody who lives with schizophrenia and is a researcher, an academic now, who researches schizophrenia. I recommend dropping past Piazza and having a look at the Voices talk by Eleanor, the TED Talk. It's a really good one. I would certainly recommend that you check in around that. All right, we've got about 5 minutes left. Let me come back to the chat and see what's happening here, and I'll answer the rest in Piazza. Okay, I can see we're actually talking about people on TikTok and so forth with various conditions. So yeah, absolutely. There's lots of people out there in social media that are telling their own stories. They're about their own lived experience of mental health issues, and generally, if you're interested in a particular topic, you can always just search it in YouTube. You could also, if you're interested in stories around everything from obsessive compulsive disorder to eating disorders, schizophrenia spectrum disorders, bipolar disorders, really complex conditions, the Sane Australia website's a good launching point. If you're interested in anxiety and depression, the Beyond Blue website is a really good launching point. And I'll provide maybe some links. I think there's a few things that I'm going to be doing just to tie off the clinical section of the subject for you later today. And I think I might provide some additional links to just things that you might be interested in around. I certainly hear people interested in treatment, for example. So keep an eye out for the various things that I'll be putting on Canvas today. So there's going to be a checklist about where we're at right now and the things that you need to have done to make sure you've successfully completed everything you needed to around the clinical course, and a bit of a checklist around mind, brain, and behavior 2. More generally, I'll be finishing off those Piazza questions and just making everything is nice and organized for you for when you come back to revision. The practice questions are currently being built in, there's so many things that we use. What's it called again? Peerwise. And that is where you'll be able to do practice questions for the mental health component of the course, and you will be able to create your own practice questions there as well and share them with your colleagues. So whilst I will, and I am going to miss lecturing, I always, by the time I get to this point where we're finishing up, I feel like I'm just getting started, and I feel like, we've only just scratched the surface of the things that I'd like to teach you. But if you keep going with psychology, then you will have further opportunity to, of course, do some work with me. But while I am going to take a step back now to make room for Abby to come on and lecture you about developmental psychology, and I'm just so thrilled that you've got Abby coming to work with you. She is someone that inspires me sincerely, and I think that you are just going to have such an educational experience with Abby. It's going to be fantastic. I'm still here. I'm going to be doing my coordinator live streams, and I think I'll probably maybe, I don't know, maybe I'll do them fortnightly, maybe I'll do them weekly, but maybe I don't want to step on Abby's toes. I want you guys to really focus on working with Abby, and I'll just pop in for maybe support around the assignment moving forward over the next couple of weeks. Oh, that's great to hear, Sandra. Thank you. Thanks, Paul. So where should we finish up? Oh, of course, the survey is live. So the time for your assignment, the time to the post-intervention survey is now live on the LMS, on Canvas. Make sure that you go and click that link and finish off that survey. It'll take 60 seconds. And I've got to work out the timing for this movie night. So I am exploring with the university library whether or not we can get access to A Beautiful Mind to watch that collectively as a movie night. And maybe we'll do that one Friday night, a couple of weeks down the track or something like that. And thank you guys. So I'm not disappearing. I'm not going to disappear. I'll still be here. I'll be supporting you around your assignment. And of course, the other thing that I want to do is really carry through this community that we've started building all the way through to the end of the year with you. So, for example, being 7 times more likely to die by suicide than their Caucasian counterparts in Australia. It's obvious that there are huge inequalities in terms of access to support and access to culturally appropriate support. Having said that, we also know that while there are areas of great need and of great inequality, there are other areas in Australia where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities have really set up incredibly effective systems, and it's those sorts of highlight, I suppose, systems and outcomes that I think we really need to look to and learn how the communities and the elders in those communities have been creating really good mental health outcomes, and learn from that rather than necessarily going in and prescribing a white man's approach to mental health, and really being guided by the local communities. So anyway, that's just my particular take. Really big question, and obviously, given that I'm getting into this area in the next year quite a bit, I'd like to talk all day about it, but I think that's where we'll tie up. So thank you, everyone, for tuning into the stream. For those of you who have left a question on Piazza, I'll go and respond there if we haven't already. And as always, thank you for helping construct the live stream. And I will look forward to seeing you again very soon. So do not fear abandonment from me. I'll still be around. Take care, everyone. Have a nice day and a nice weekend, and look forward to some really interesting developmental psychology with Abby next week. Okay, take care, everyone. Bye now.